Welcome to the INTJ equation, everybody. Thank you for joining me. Today we're going to look at The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel Van Der Kolk. He is an INFJ. We got 94 slides for this session. We have part 2 on September 18th at 4 p.m. Mountain Standard Time at this time. The time zones in Arizona are kind of wonky, so it's probably actually 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time because I had a mix-up with a podcast, but we'll go ahead and get started because we have a lot to cover. So it just pretty much talks about the effects of trauma basically on the mind and body and how to heal from it basically. All right, here's some CDC statistics, even though I'm not big on statistics, and this is probably a lot higher than projected for the U.S. 1 out of 5 kids are molested. 1 out of 4 are beaten by a parent. 1 out of 3 couples participate in domestic violence in some capacity. 1 out of 4 people have alcoholic resident or relatives, and 1 out of 8 witnessed their mother beaten pretty severely. So those are pretty startling. Trauma is a lot more prevalent than we think, and we'd like to admit. And it's something definitely that we are conditioned to not talk about in society, which is not good. So part 1 is called The Rediscovery of Trauma. Chapter 1 is Lessons from Vietnam Veterans. This is when Dr. Van Der Kolk got into medicine. And I'll probably do like a little brief Q&A at the end of each chapter. So if you have questions and you're watching, please put them in the chat and I'll get to them eventually. I just have a lot to cover. So I had to divide this book up into 2 parts. Tom, described as smart, athletic, and a natural leader, drinks heavily and rides a Harley recklessly. Just the little bit I read about him, he sounds like an ESTP. He's a Vietnam vet in case you missed it. And of course, I can't go with everything in this book. This has been one of my favorite books so far, and there's a lot to cover in here. And it's very poignant for me, so I'm going to get through as much as I can. While in Vietnam overseas, he witnessed his whole platoon basically murdered. And the very next day, he went to a village and where he just slaughtered kids. He raped a woman and killed an innocent farmer the very next day, and that was just something that he had to live with. He pretty much disassociated and zoned out and committed this atrocity basically. He suffers anhedonia, which is pretty much a lack of pleasure. There's social anhedonia and regular anhedonia. He had very high temper with his mother or with his family basically. He struggled to be loving towards his family, was very cold and distant with them. He only feels alive with thrill seeking. So like you said, he drinks and rides Harleys really fast and recklessly, which kind of reminds me of a story. I don't know if I have it prompted in here of my ESTP grandpa. Definitely sound like an ESTP. He died before I was born. He was a World War II and a Korean vet. Then after that, I guess he just couldn't stop killing. From what I'm told, I never met him, and I really don't know the side of the family. It's very, very screwed up. He became a mercenary basically, and he rode his motorcycle, I don't know if it was a Harley or not, down to Chile, where he met my grandma. Basically moved back to the States, and he terrorized his family. Pretty much beat my grandma until she was schizophrenic. I didn't meet her either. She moved back to Chile before I was born and was institutionalized the rest of her life, from according to my ESTP dad, who I don't really buy. I don't know. I mean, this story could be true just based on the horrible things he did to me. I'll be very open about myself in this presentation as well. But yeah, war is horrible. Even the after effects of war, after it's said and done on the people, not good for sure. And this is Van Der Kolk, just a little outline of like how his attitude is towards this book. He seems pretty ambivalent towards meds. He does see a place for them, but they are overprescribed and over-glorified. He can definitely see through how it's just a Ponzi scheme to get money, basically. There is a place for them, but there's too big of a place for them, and they replaced a lot of different aspects of treatment. He did study psychedelics in the 1970s, I believe. I can't retain the whole book, so pardon me if I'm incorrect here, and feel free to correct me in the comments or in the live chat. He did look into some acid and LSD, which you can definitely watch the video I just put out just a few days ago. And he definitely has a lot of NI patterns flavored with FE, which is great. There's definitely a lot of NI predictions and a lot of NI pattern seeking in this book. So if you haven't checked it out yet, it should be down in the description below. It was like $11 and change, and it's a pretty lengthy book. All right, in this chapter, he talks about schizophrenic patients and how he doesn't talk much about schizophrenia and hallucinating and psychosis in this book, which I wish he touched more on. Maybe he doesn't, or not aware of that, but pretty much like when they're being psychotic, they're reliving trauma. I work at a psych hospital, and I can definitely see this. I used to work at a school with kids with behavioral issues, and there's this one girl who would react, I guess, being lured into a van, sadly. And now it's a part of her hallucinations. And just to be quick, this is going to be a pretty graphic presentation. This was a fairly graphic book, so viewer discretion is advised if you're sensitive to this sort of thing. Back during the time when he was doing his studies, he first got into medicine, was a med student right after Vietnam, basically. And there was a whole plethora of Vietnam vets that needed treated. There wasn't no books on PTSD, and I think the diagnosis barely started coming out. Not very good with details as an INTJ, and I had to make 94 slides for this presentation, like 70, 80 something for the next one. So it's probably riddled with errors. So grammar Nazis, feel free to correct me in the comments. And he just started seeing how meds started taking over real treatment. I know he was talking about like how in a hospital they had a swimming pool and an exercise yard, and they pretty much plowed it down to build a med center, which is sad. Trauma and the loss of self. Tom lost control and he massacred the whole village. People with trauma, basically, they struggle with their own self-identity. For years, I struggled with my own self-identity. I'm still trying to find myself, and my life's halfway over, shamefully. So if you're young and you're watching this, feel free to reach out for help. You need to find yourself, and don't waste your life, of course. Often kids feel guilty and shame over maintaining relationships with their abuser. I know when I was growing up, a lot of times, like, I would kind of minimize my parents' behavior. I thought it was normal until a therapist pretty much told me that my thinking was flawed. And we're going to talk about CBT therapy here, either in this section or the next, probably this one. This is mostly about treatment modalities or I guess the effects of trauma, and the next part's about treatment modalities. Numbing is something that people with trauma are very prone to. Emotionally distant with relationships, which definitely sounds like avoidant personality disorder. My theories on personality disorders and a lot of mental illnesses that they're just CPTSD, which is what him and his organization pretty much coined, which I'll talk about later. And it kind of varies with type and basically the trauma you receive throughout life. And if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the comments. I know the last podcast I did, there were no questions, so I don't know if there's something wrong with that or you just don't have any questions. So if there are any, I apologize if I'm not seeing them. I'll try to monitor my Discord server as well. I got to bring that up, I guess. But yeah, go ahead and feel free to ask questions. I'll get to them probably after a chapter. But I do got a lot of material to breeze through. Disassociation, which is something we're going to get more into as the slide goes on. It's definitely something NI-DOMs, I think, kind of do naturally, and we can be mistaken as mentally ill, which we often are. You don't recognize yourself. It even gets so bad where people don't recognize themselves in the mirror. And you kind of observe yourself from a distance. I know, like, I have a flashback sometimes, which I just kind of resolved in EMDR therapy, which is a treatment modality, which is great, which is mentioned quite a bit in this book. It's later on in the part 2 of our presentation. So make sure to stick around for that on September 18th. NI and disassociation. Here we go. So NI DOMs, we like to daydream. We like to ponder about what could be our own deep fantasy lives. We're always zoned out, kind of accused of ADHD in that aspect of us, even though we're usually pretty hyper-focused on stuff we want to. I was tested out for disassociation during my beginning stages of EMDR, which I'm probably about 5-6 sessions into. And I tested almost fairly high, or high enough on the disassociation scale where I couldn't be treated because it would have brought back too much trauma, but I guess I was kosher there, luckily. That was chapter 1. So chapter 2, revolutions in understanding the mind and brain. And yeah, I got some pretty cool images here, but I only get so many throughout the month, so I kind of had to slow down through this, so I apologize. All right, he talks about how patients opens up. Well, sorry about the typos in here again. While working long nights at the hospital, which I can relate to. Doctors usually see their patients for 15 minutes at a time, and I don't know if you ever went to the doctor. They're usually quite arrogant, and they think they know everything about you and know what's better about you than yourself, even though you live with yourself every day. So yeah, that's a thing. Talks about schizophrenia patients reliving their trauma through hallucinations, which I've mentioned that I've seen before, and it's pretty heartbreaking. Just last week, I was with a woman, and we didn't know she was suicidal, and she tried choking herself to death with her pants in the hospital that I work at. I found her, and she told me that it was tied around her neck, and it took me a while to get the pants off. Luckily, she lived, but she was very disruptive and angry throughout the rest of the night. And she basically had voices, internal stimuli, pretty much telling her to kill herself. And she was banging her head against a mirror, an unbreakable mirror. And yeah, I mean, these people have inner turmoil, but man, they take it out on others. It's not intentional, but it's a very horrible thing to see and experience. I could imagine having something like schizophrenia. I thought I was going off the edge one time. There was a point in my life where I was hallucinating, and I was scared shitless, to be honest. But it subsided, luckily. Common practice to hold down patients and administer antipsychotic meds, which we had to do with her, the female patient I was just talking about. A female with trauma must relive trauma by being gang raped by. There was a female patient mentioned in his book that she relived the trauma every time she was held down in these psych hospitals. And it was very, reliving the trauma was very traumatic. But, if you're going to kill yourself or you're going to kill others, what do we do in a hospital situation? Sadly, like, there's men and women grouped together. There's boys and girls grouped together in these hospitals. And it's very safe for the females, I think, and elderly patients and children. SJs decide this shit. I don't know. It's not me. But, if you're going to hurt somebody, we have to calm you down somehow. And if you're resistant, of course, we're going to have to hold you down and do it ourselves, I guess. Van Der Kolk witnessed firsthand when meds became the dominant form of treatment. So, like, pre-meds, I think meds started taking over in the 60s and 70s, really. People actually tried to help you solve your problems without medication. I think there was a brief period where that started, but, back like in 1800s and medieval days and beyond, people would drill holes in your head and leeches with your blood, and a lot of weird modalities that didn't work. But I guess this is progress. Even though medication just numbs a problem and doesn't solve it, meds can be super beneficial for a lot of people. I've seen people get stabilized with their schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, bipolar disorder. But something like a personality disorder, like avoidant personality disorder, is pretty much med resistance, because it's basically your brain is altered and trauma has affected you, your psyche, your personality. I guess some good numbers for meds in defense of it. 500,000 people were living in psych hospitals in 1955. And in 1996, due to antipsychotic meds, that number was reduced to 100,000. And I'm ambivalent towards meds, but I'm mostly probably 90% against them in most cases. And you got to remember, in 1955, it was probably pretty ghetto, and treatments weren't all that great. I got some words there that are missing, but it's probably just this. All right, this is Ford from the DSM-3, the Diagnostic Statistics Manual, Edition 3, if you're not familiar with what this is. We are on 5, and they're probably going to release 6 soon. It's basically just the SJ conglomerate of all these mental illnesses where they think they have all the answers, basically the Bible of psychiatry. And this is what the DSM-3 said, a quote from it. Now, the forward to the landmark in the 1980 DSM-3 was appropriately modest and acknowledged that the diagnostic system was imprecise, so imprecise that it never should be used as forensic or insurance purposes. Tell you a little experience I had working in an outpatient mental health facility for kids. I was reviewing a patient with my supervisor, which is called a supervision in the field. And she basically wanted me to diagnose the patient with ADHD. We didn't see this patient firsthand. We had no experience with this patient. We didn't evaluate him. I don't even have a bachelor's degree. She barely had a bachelor's degree. A lot of people are under the impression that you have a deep, thorough you're psychoanalyzed basically by a psychologist or a psychiatrist, and she wanted me to label him ADHD. I told her I wasn't comfortable with that. She looked through his file and found some, I guess, stereotypes of ADHD in there, which we're going to talk about more, and it parallels my theories on ADHD and trauma. A lot of parallels with this book. That's why it's one of my favorite. It kind of validated a lot of my own thoughts, and it definitely opened up to a lot more modalities. But basically, We label this kid ADHD, put him on meds, and it's basically factory treatment here. Siegelman Mayer conducted electroshock tests on dogs, and they were shocked and stayed in cages. When they opened the cages, the dogs that were shocked were traumatized, and they wouldn't leave the cages, but the other dogs that weren't just ran out. And they had to force these dogs. They had to pull them out of the cage physically to get them to realize that there's a route of escape. So when you're traumatized, your brain basically shuts down, and there's fight, flight, and freeze mode. These dogs were unfortunately in freeze mode, and it's very, I guess, a cruel treatment. Even though I'm not a dog person, I don't believe in torturing and harming animals, but I guess it's better than torturing, harming humans, because humans can get guns and we'll shoot them all. I don't know. I guess that's my take on it. And if there's any comments and you know how to reach me, please let me know if you're not able to comment, because I'm not seeing anything. If you do have them, go ahead and put them in the chat. People become addicted to trauma. This is why people stay in abusive relationships, mostly women, but men do too. I guess I was in abusive relationships, but not like a battered male sort of thing. But Julie was raped at gunpoint. She became a prostitute after, I guess, this situation. And she completed treatment, but returned to the lifestyle, returned to her pimp boyfriend, who basically continued to abuse her and neglect her. And Freud, he does mention Jung and Freud in this book, mostly Freud. He does mention Jung a little bit. And it's the compulsion to repeat, basically what Freud called it. And people reenact. Freudians believe that people react to learn to cope with trauma. I've seen people reenact trauma all the time. Sadly, like there's this kid yesterday in the hospital. He was freaking out, had a breakdown, and he wanted to be locked into the seclusion room, which is a very tiny room where we can keep people safe from hurting themselves. And he pretty much said that he was locked up a lot as a kid, as a younger kid. And I guess he was just kind of reliving that trauma. I think he was exacerbated by males. I think he was particularly scared of me. But we calmed him down eventually, and I played a game of checkers with him, and he seemed to appreciate that. So serotonin levels cause more hyperactivity to animals with lower amounts in the amygdala. So serotonin is a big cause of depression. There's a big theory, and he talks about in this book, where if you're depressed, you basically have lower levels of serotonin in your brain, and that's kind of been debunked, but they still hold on to this paradigm because it's profitable. Drugs make money. So the higher amount of serotonin in their brains, these animals were able to self-soothe. People with trauma, they tend not to be able to self-soothe. They lose control. They get violent. They get violent amongst themselves. They just shut down. They self-isolate, which is a problem that I've had. And we look a lot at Prozac, which is one of the tried and true antidepressants throughout, I guess, medical history. And it compared placebo, and it does work better at calming emotions and sleep, but it pretty much has little to no effect on PTSD. Again, meds mask symptoms. But if you can mask those symptoms and take the meds while taking modalities of treatment, then, if it works for you, it works for you. It didn't work for me necessarily. The drug revolution that started out with so much promise may, in the end, have done as much harm as good. And this is a quote from Van Der Kolk. The theory that mental illness is caused primarily by chemical imbalances in the brain that can be corrected by specific drugs has become broadly accepted by the media and the public as well, and as by the medical profession. So yeah, there was these studies, I think in the 50s, where pretty much said that depression and all these mental illnesses are caused by chemical imbalances in the brain, and they can be corrected by meds. But there's also studies that are not, and I read this in a psychology book in one of my classes too, that about 50% of the studies show that antidepressants don't help. But of course, those studies are swept under the rug because that would affect Big Pharma's agenda, right? And meds can be helpful. I've seen a lot of cases where they are helpful, but a lot of cases they just give you horrible side effects and they don't work. But they deflect dealing with the problems. Meds replace therapy and treatment often. Medicaid spends more on antipsychotics than any other type of drug. Again, sorry for the typos. In 2008, there was $3.6 billion spent, and from 9 years, it was $1.65 billion. So meds, just these big pharma companies just keep getting richer and richer, and antipsychotic drugs are one of the biggest drugs that they use, one of the biggest money makers, basically, one of the highest prescribed drugs. All right, chapter 3, looking into the brain, the neuroscience revolution. Study that reused scripts to recreate trauma. So basically they did a study where, I don't know, I didn't get into the details of what script they used, but it basically did something where it recreated trauma. It's like a movie that plays in your head and it just happens over and over again, unfortunately, for people. And it does have a story of Marsha ran, not 10, a red light, killing her daughter, an unborn baby. She was triggered by kids' laughter, and she was a school teacher, so she had to get into an administrative position there. The script that they read made her relive her trauma, and they did EEG, and it seemed that it activated her limbic system, and there's some neuroscience. By the way, next month's selection is The Neuroscience of Personality by Dario Nardi. It is going to be on October 2nd at 4 p.m. Pacific time, Mountain Standard Time. I'll let you know for sure. Like I said, the time zones are kind of wonky. Also, my son is going through some major behavioral issues that are, quite frankly, kind of starting to scare me at school. It's triggered by school. He doesn't really have a history of trauma that I know of, but I'm definitely really worried about him. And I could be changing jobs, and my schedule could be doing a 180 flip. So there'll probably be a slowdown from content. I won't be taking a long break, but I probably won't be pumping out as much content. Bronchus area is one of the main areas for speech. During the script study, when they were reliving the trauma, it went offline. I was trying to talk to this schizophrenic kid yesterday, and schizophrenia is pretty rarely diagnosed in kids, but he was transgender and had thoughts of hurting himself and others. I guess he trusted a male nurse there. He wouldn't really talk to me. He was kind of just standing in front of where this mirror used to be, but a patient ripped it off previously. And I tried asking him if he's okay, and he just kind of stared blankly where the mirror was. So my heart's out to that kid. And it showed very similar to stroke victims, basically people who have strokes and they're not functioning as normally as they used to be. It's pretty much the same as they were when people were living the trauma. Trauma reenactments show that it activates the right hemisphere of the brain and deactivates the left. EMDR, which I am taking, and it's great. It can be pretty rough, though. Switches the brain from left to right when you're reprocessing traumatic memories. I could actually feel my eyes kind of going left to right. And my therapist explained that's basically going back and forth between your left and right brains when you're reprocessing these horrible memories that you have. And again, if you have any questions, put them in the chat. I'm not sure what's going on, if it's disabled or something, because I didn't get them last time. Maybe people are just being wallflowers, so go ahead and any comments or questions, put them in the chat. Normally, right and left brain work together. Can be debilitating when one is offline. Left brain makes rationale of the experience and converts it to speech. The right brain makes it seem like the event is happening in real time. So when you're having a traumatic event, it shuts down your left brain, which is the rational way to interpret it, and it converts it to speech where you can talk about it. And the right brain pretty much makes you relive it. It's basically like the movie projector in your head that won't stop. We flew through part 1, so we're now in part 2. I guess we didn't fly through it. We're 26 minutes in. This is your brain on trauma. Chapter 4, running for your life, anatomy of survival. Noam, a young boy who witnessed and fled 9/11 while he was in his classroom, drew a picture of the survivors using a trampoline to cope with what he witnessed. So you can see people jumping out of a fire building, and that black spot right there, if you can see it, is a trampoline. So basically this is a picture from the book too. I just took a picture on my phone. Pretty much what Van Der Kolk is saying, that he tried to rationalize what he saw during the 9/11 with basically like firefighters saving them with giant trampolines, and they're able to jump and survive themselves. But what in reality saw was a bunch of people jumping out of a firing building and hitting the concrete and pavement very hard and dying, which is horrible for a 5-year-old to witness for sure. Traumatized people can become stuck, can't integrate to new experiences in life, results in chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, and other autoimmune diseases. Birth to 3 are very crucial years. I remember just going back when people get stuck in trauma. I don't know if this is related, but when I when I worked in prison, the inmates basically were stuck in the year that they were incarcerated. I don't know if you ever watched like those old movies like Blood In, Blood Out and American Me. You see the Mexican Cholo guys. I saw a few old timers that were like that, like "What up, Holmes?" and stuff like that. So I guess they didn't get with the times, and because the Mexican gangs don't really talk like that anymore. Birth to three, they were probably the worst parts of my life, and I think that's why it affected me so greatly with my avoidant personality disorder. And pretty much your brain is like Play-Doh, and it molds to your environment. And if you don't have a good environment, it is going to be a very difficult life for you. This is where you learn to interact and socialize. I was kept away from people. My mom was borderline narcissistic, and my dad was just batshit crazy. Then my stepdad came in, and he's borderline narcissistic as well. Just a little background for me if you haven't heard it yet. And if you like this presentation, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. And I'm sorry if it's if you're an FE user and it's bringing up a lot of memories or a lot of feelings for you, I guess. I don't know exactly how that works because I'm FE trickster. Oh yeah, these are some of the worst years of my life, even though I don't remember them day to day, but I'm affected by it daily, of course. And some neuroscience here. He calls the frontal lobes in the brain the the seat of empathy, basically. Critical for relationships and others. And during these birth to 3 years, basically, that's when your brain is developing the frontal lobes. And I guess it just doesn't get it if you don't have it throughout life. Frontal lobes moderate emotions. This is something that people with trauma, they can't regulate emotions, especially with like borderline personality disorder. I was working in a kids unit last night, and these two kids were pretty much picking up each other and slamming each other on mats. And I worked in a prison, like I said, and basically what they train you to do, beat it in your head, is yell very loud, clear verbal directives to stop. And that triggered one of the kids, and he was trying to fight a nurse who pretty much didn't have anything to do with the situation. And he took a while to calm down, but we calmed him down without having to give him shots. We give him meds by mouth. The amygdala triggers cortisol and adrenaline, which are hormones in your body, which are related to stress, powerful stress hormones. They trigger the fight or flight response. They are damaged with trauma, and your brain basically stays in flight or fight mode or freeze mode. Medial prefrontal cortex acts as a watchtower, as Van Der Kolk states, and identifies emotional states of others. Definitely really want to reanalyze Dario Nardi's neuroscience and personality. I would like to see more studies on it and see what other effects of the brain that it has, but I wonder if the prefrontal cortex is related to FE, and INTJs and ISTJs, they're not as active, because I do struggle with the emotional states of others. Balance needed between the amygdala and the medial prefrontal cortex. PTS makes that balance much more difficult. For now, I want to emphasize that emotion is not opposed to reason. I'll quote again, our emotions assign value to experiences and thus are the foundation of reason. Our self-experience is a product of balance between our rational and our emotional brain. A lot of great quotes in here. Stan and Udi were involved in the largest pileup in Canadian history. They reacted completely different to their experience. Udi froze and basically had to be pulled from the wreckage, and Stan reacted but was traumatized. I remember in the book they recall that right above them there was a woman burning to death in a car, and she was screaming, and Stan was helpless to help her, and Udi just froze. Both became more irritable. Stan's flashbacks were much more reactive, and hers were passive. I kind of wonder if this is linked to introversion and extroversion. I noticed in the hospital patients, the introverted ones, they kind of bottle it up, and they're more like internally self-explosive, while the extroverts pretty much take it out on everybody else in their environment. They are more prone to violent outbursts, I think, more yelling, while internal people will cut, self-isolate, and keep it to themselves and just kind of quietly walk off and try to kill themselves. So I definitely see correlations there. Not that extroverts can't be suicidal. They definitely are suicidal. I think the highest percentage of types I do see in these hospitals are ESTPs followed by ESFPs. No surprise there, because they clog up the prison system as well with their NI inferior, which in their any demon, which is, I think, is affecting my son at this point, any demon basically. For SFPs, when they don't want to do something, when they don't go deviate their own vision and their own wants, they become belligerent and violent. And I think this is what's happening to my son. He is throwing desks, flipping tables, throwing chairs, kicking kids. When he's asked to do his schoolwork, he just flat out refuses. He doesn't have a history of trauma that I know of. Maybe something happened that I'm not aware of when he was at preschool or with my stepsister, but you can't live in fear, and you got to let your kids live their life. Hopefully we were able to resolve this for him and help him. I'm worried about him though. Another quote: "Disassociation is the essence of trauma. The overwhelming experience is split off and fragmented so that the emotions, sounds, images, thoughts, and physical sensations related to trauma take a life of their own." I think these symptoms, like I mentioned earlier, overlap with introverted intuition. Like, I will just zone out and not hear people talking to me. I'll be so deep in thought. A lot of times I am reliving my trauma. A lot of times I'm just thinking about something stupid. I definitely have a rich fantasy world, which a lot of people who disassociate revert to. Yeah, here's more of it down here. Zoning out, not living in a present moment. Definitely sounds like NI, SC inferior. And I'm trying to tie this to type, even though it's not a type book. I think everything goes back to typology in a way. Living in fantasy compulsions, huge reason why any heroes are deemed mentally ill. I think this could be the case in a lot of times because we're different from everybody else. We're crazy. Chapter 5, Body-Brain Connections. Darwin identifies PTSD before it was coined in the expression of the emotions in man and animals. He's more mostly, I guess, known for his other book that kind of gave the evolution theory, but this is another book that I might check out one day. Western science didn't identify bilateral communication between body and mind, but ancient Chinese and Indian practices had it right all along. He talks about yoga a lot in this book. Yoga has been beneficial for me, and acupuncture is a big one too, but he doesn't talk much about acupuncture. He does talk about pressing acupressure points, but not much about acupuncture itself. If you had any Eastern modalities be beneficial for you, let me know in the comments or in the chat. More dog experience. A Russian named Pavlov had a famous experience with dogs with dinner bells, and it made dogs salivate. Basically what he did, this study is talked about to death, basically, but he wanted to condition dogs to basically salivate, to secrete saliva from their mouths during at the ring of a dinner bell. So every time he fed a dog some meat, his mouth would salivate because it's craving food and ready to eat. But he got to the point where he would just ring the bell and the dogs would start drooling without the bells. Anyways, same image I used earlier, but I used it in the wrong spot. He kept the dogs in cages in a basement, and the river flooded one day, and it flooded his basement. And these dogs, they didn't die, but, well, if you're stuck in a cage and you think you're going to drown, you'd probably be traumatized too. And these dogs basically became traumatized. Coined it the reflexive purpose, the most important aspect of life. All creatures need purpose, even if it's to reproduce. I mean, dogs and animals are pretty primitive. They don't have deep, meaningful lives like we do, I guess, as humans. The autonomic nervous system is the accelerator of the body. The parasympathetic nervous system acts as a brake. So these dogs basically in these cages, they were traumatized, and they wouldn't leave the cages like they were in this other study earlier I talked about, where the dogs were basically electrocuted and they were held captive in an open cage and they were forced to leave. And to achieve, you must experience immobilization without fear. It took me hours and hours to put this presentation together, read this book, research it, highlight it, go back through it. So I would appreciate a quick thumbs up. It would mean a lot to me. Chapter 6, Losing Your Body, Losing Yourself. Over the years, our research team has repeatedly found that chronic emotional abuse and neglect can be just as devastating as physical and sexual molestation. My biological dad definitely physically abused me. My mom and stepdad, besides spankings and the occasional shove, didn't physically abuse me. Sexual abuse is probably the only thing I haven't received, or at least I don't receive. We'll definitely talk about people blocking out memory who are traumatized later on. I was emotionally abused and neglected, especially on in my early years. So that's how I developed ABPD as an INTJ. If you have abuse and you want to share it, definitely let me know in the comments, or you can find my contact information in the description below. Sherry was emotionally and verbally abused by her mom, who ran a foster home. Basically treated her daughter as a slave driver, made her work on the other kids, and she would tell her that she didn't belong there, even though she was her biological kid. She became emotionally and physically numb. Another term we're going to talk about here. Basically, she couldn't feel her own body sensations. Another thing that with NI DOMs is we have SI demon. and we're not aware of bodily sensations a lot of times. And this is pretty indicative of trauma. Like we'll cut ourselves while working and we don't know. Another interesting aspect is that we could either eat too much, which is a problem that I have with because we don't feel that we're full, or we don't realize that we're hungry at all. We will go without eating or drinking. A lot of INTJs, INFJs have that problem. I don't. I constantly have to have something to drink, as you can see. Maybe it's living in a desert my whole life. I don't know. But anyway, she couldn't feel anything, so she would pick her skin to feel something. She was reluctant to do so. And while she was receiving massage therapy as treatment, the massage therapist left site. She was massaging her feet and she couldn't feel her massaging her feet. And she started freaking out. Like, where did you go? Disassociation was so strong. Again, that's disassociating. Kind of couldn't feel her own bodily sensations, was out of her own body, basically. Lost track of the therapist. And Dr. Elenia scanned the brains of 16 normal people, as well as 18 people with childhood trauma. Traumatized people showed no signs of self-sensing areas of the brain. So basically, they hook this machine up to your head. It's called an EEG. They compare people who are traumatized to neurotypical people and kind of lose a sense of yourself. You lose your senses basically when you're traumatized and you're disassociating and having flashbacks and all that stuff. Traumatized people shut down feelings of terror. Agency terms for being in charge of your own life is what I think Van Der Kolk coined. Traumatized people feel unsafe in their bodies. Alexithymia is basically we're not being able to describe your feelings, which is something that I struggled with. I think people, INTJs with FI child and FE trickster, I can feel things very deeply, but I don't know exactly what I'm feeling. People are prescribed psych meds to distract themselves and the self-work that needs to be completed. So basically meds, as he talked about earlier, replace a lot of modalities for treatment. And give this video a quick thumbs up if you're enjoying it so far. All right, 42 minutes in, we're part 3, the minds of children. Getting on the same wavelength, attachment and attunement is chapter 7. People do horrible things to kids. It is just terrible. I worked in prisons. I met the abusers. I think the only urge I had to ever kill anybody when I was sitting with a reclassification of this inmate who tied up this little boy and sodomized him with the handle of a hammer. I just wanted to slit his throat, but of course I didn't. Now I work in a mental institution and I worked with kids under DCS, CPS in some areas of the United States, and I hear the horrible stories that happen to kids, and some horrible things happen to me, of course, as I mentioned. It's very common and unfortunate, and it's probably society's biggest problem and something that we need to figure out. Our government here in the United States, if you're not in the United States, is more concerned about murdering people overseas for their own agenda rather than treating our own people here. So we have a behavioral health disaster here in the United States. People blame guns, and guns are just a tool for nefarious things. Guns can also be used for good. They can protect people, but yeah, it's pretty bad over here. One example is a 5-year-old girl who saw her mother as a prostitute being raped, dismembered, and burned. It reminds me a lot of Dexter. Adverse experience lead to personality disorders, which aren't typically diagnosed and properly treated until the age of 18, and that is just too late. They won't really diagnose personality disorders because your personality is still forming until you're 18. I don't know what this magic number of 18 comes from, but why are you not going to treat it until the brain sets? Why it's like, okay, I'm going to dump this slab of concrete here and I'm not going to smooth it out and form it into a sidewalk. I'm going to have a giant lump and it's just going to sit here in my yard instead of having something smooth and safe to walk on. That's basically what they're doing, treating kids with personality disorders. Their brain is like Play-Doh. So, okay, we're just going to throw it outside and let it harden instead of shape it to where it needs to be. Just fucking ridiculous. I think this is intentional in a lot of ways. And censors, they basically ruin psychology. As you can see, as he talks about here, it doesn't say directly that, but pretty much like he gets shut down with a lot of things, which we'll talk about. Attachment styles and trauma. Anxious, avoidant, and secure, which should be secure. Again, I was doing this on my phone and doesn't have very good spell check, and yeah, it's pretty time consuming making 94 PowerPoint presentations on a phone. Children become attached to whatever functions as their primary caregiver, but the nature of that attachment, whether it's secure or insecure, makes a huge difference of the course of the child's life. So there's a big misconception that INTJs can't have an Anxious attachment style. Basically, the difference between those are anxious attachment style basically is when you're bullied relentlessly as a kid and you kind of grow up to thinking that you're very scared that people are going to leave you. You can be kind of clingy. When I was younger, up to probably about 32, I was like that. Now I became more avoidant in my attachment style, which is very confusing because I've had avoidant personality disorder since I was probably about 10 or 11. INTJs can't have an anxious avoidant style. Babies can't regulate their emotional state. They depend on adults to kind of soothe them and teach them how to self-soothe, which is kind of why I'm scared about my son. I would lose my temper and yell at him a lot because that's how I was raised, and INTJs are insanely impatient with their SI demon and SE inferior. But I was loving and to him, but not really when he was a baby, but when he was a little bit older, like toddler. SE DOMs, I think he's going to be an ESFP, maybe ESTP. They're probably the hardest kids to raise because that NI inferior, NI demon, yeah, it's pretty hard to handle. If the caregiver doesn't assist with this at a young age, it's hard for these kids to learn it as an adult. So basically, like criminals, they're very impulsive. They're very agitated, like with antisocial personality disorder. They just pretty much go for the low-hanging fruit, and that low-hanging fruit is the forbidden fruit in the Bible, basically. Kids cry when they need help, and if they're not getting the help they need, they learn that crying doesn't meet their needs, basically. So they may cry incessantly throughout life, or they may learn just to shut down their emotions and learn that their emotions don't matter, which has happened with my parents. Basically, they locked me in a room and wouldn't feed me and all this stuff. As a kid, I was secluded. Mothers and coddling their babies has a very lifelong effect on their sense of self. Like if you just leave a baby in a crib and just ignore them, they're going to get fucked up pretty much in one way or another. My mom wasn't very affectionate towards me. She was very cold and distant. So I think that was a lot of my problems, which I think is where a lot of people who are autistic just experience this, unfortunately. I definitely worked with kids with autism and stuff, and they did have loving caregivers. And sometimes you're just born autistic, but I think there's trauma where it just kind of parallels autism. I did talk to an INTJ named Mike. He is diagnosed with autism. I think, no, maybe it wasn't autism. It was definitely schizoid personality disorder and ADHD, which is a diagnosis they pass out freely. And he does talk about being raised by an ESTJ mother. If you're raised by an ESTJ, my condolences go out to you. I am so sorry. Most people have secure attachment styles. This comes from having reliable caregivers. So people who have no problems with relationships, who are okay, handle breakups, can handle. Basically, if you're raised in a loving environment, you're probably not going to have problems in relationships, and you're going to have a secure attachment style. Kids are attuned to facial expressions and tone of voice and hypersensitive to anger. Like I said, I would lose my temper with my son sometimes, and I try to control myself. I really do, but it's really hard. I am not perfect by any means, and I'm trying to get over my stuff. Avoidant attachment. Basically, when you don't cry or react when the mothers leave the room. I remember when I started kindergarten, my mother was very horrible and mean to me. I would cling on to her and I wouldn't let her go. I didn't want to leave, but I was in Head Start before that, and I was abused by my teacher. She would like throw me against walls and stuff like that, and grab me by the throat and slam me against them because I wasn't around kids or people. And one day I had to go to school and I didn't know how to handle it. When they're affected, like they did studies on people who had avoidant attachment style, and they wouldn't really react outwardly to what was going on, but they see that their heart rate increased and it became hyper vigilant. Anxious attachment style, which I had when I was younger, but now I'm definitely more avoidant. They cling and cry for attention, which like I said, I did when I went to kindergarten. I would just hold on to my mom's leg and cry and beg not to go, but I eventually got used to it, even though I was bullied on a daily basis by pretty much everybody. I've heard people say that INTJs never have anxious attachment style, which I just talked about, so I won't touch again. Avoidant kids often bully others. So kids with avoidant attachment style, they avoid relationships. They are often the bullies, and anxious are often the victims. I had an anxious attachment style while growing up, and I was bullied relentlessly in school by adults, kids, everybody. Bullied at home, bullied by my little sister. My little sister and my stepdad would tag team on me and make my life living hell. Sorry, I think it's important to share trauma and experiences, and we are conditioned not to share them. So I just share them freely. It's not asking for pity or anything. I think it's just important. I encourage other people to do so. It can be very therapeutic, what he talks about here in the book. Studies have shown that gender and basic temperament have no effect basically on what attachment style you may get as an adult, but I am curious about personality type. Like I said, most INTJs have an avoidant personality attachment style, but anxious ones are out there for sure. I think SC inferior can make you very anxious, and we kind of put on this facade that we're not affected by it, but we often are. Another quote, and basically, if it doesn't have somebody's name behind it, these are all by Bessel Van Der Kolk. So this is by Bessel Van Der Kolk. If you feel chronically numbed out, potentially dangerous situations may make you feel alive. If you conclude that you must be a terrible person because why else would have your parents treated you that way, you start expecting other people to treat you horribly. A lot of these quotes in here that I point out, and a lot of this book is one of my favorite books I ever read. Been very beneficial. Yeah, this is basically my life in a nutshell. I just would feel numb. I wouldn't feel my own emotions, couldn't pinpoint them. I think I like to work in a psychiatric hospital because when I am responding to agitated patients and stuff like that and saving people from killing themselves, it does make me feel a little bit alive. I think that's why I'm mistaken for an ESTP, just because I do like to engage my SC in that manner. I do judo. I haven't been doing judo as much lately because my mind wants to, but my body doesn't. I'm just turned 38, so I'm getting up there, I guess. And I always felt like I was a terrible person and I deserved what happened to me. I think avoidant personality disorder is a deep self-hatred, basically. And you feel deserving of the horrible things that you get throughout your life, like not having loving relationships, even as an adult. Chapter 8, trapped in relationships, the cost of abuse and neglect. This is kind of like battered woman syndrome, women who keep going back to these abusive relationships. Very frustrating for men when all women who have been abused say that all men are dogs and pigs, but they keep going to the ESTP who sells coke out of the trunk of his Camaro and beats them on a daily basis. And these are defined as real men. But all men are like this. Okay, this is really screwed up here. This is pretty much a drawing right here from a woman with repressed memories. She said that she had a happy childhood, but this is a drawing that when Bessel Van Der Kolk prompted her to draw a memory from her childhood, she was basically locked in a closet with adults tormenting her, and somebody had a giant penis, as you can see. So, and she was convinced that she had a healthy childhood. I remember when I was talking to my therapist when I first started therapy, I pretty much said that my childhood was normal, but I guess that's basically normal for you, and trauma kind of stunts your brain, and normal is not normal. Definitely isn't like watching an episode of Full House. Van Der Kolk's and I was seeing pattern of incest and autoimmune disorders. Incest survivors struggle to distinguish between danger and safety. Marilyn would hear the footsteps of her father and start to disassociate, lost a sense of herself, and she felt unbearable feelings of loneliness and uncontrollable rage and anger. I know throughout this book, I've read several instances where mostly women, were recalling being molested, and they would kind of leave their body during the experience and picture somebody else being molested, which is horrible. I don't know how people can molest a kid. It's disgusting, especially your own kid. Chapter 9, what's love got to do with it? And another quote by Van Der Kolk, if doctors focus on their mood swings, they'll be identified as bipolar and prescribed lithium or valproate. Professionals are more impressed with their despair. They will be told they are suffering from major depression and given antidepressants. If the doctor focuses on their restlessness and lack of attention, they may be categorized with ADHD and treated with Ritalin or other stimulants. And if the clinic staff happens to take trauma history and the patient actually volunteers the relevant information, he or she might receive the diagnosis of PTSD. So he talks about throughout this book, the DSM-3, which we're going to get in here. I guess I'll read these prompts and go on that tangent. Van Der Kolk repeats that the DSM-3 states that it never should have been used for forensic and insurance purposes, which is basically the bread and butter of this fucking manual these days. Like I talked about earlier in this presentation about how I was almost forced to diagnose a kid with ADHD that I never even met, and I don't have an advanced degree whatsoever. I have an associate's, which I don't think degrees are all that important, but in SJ world it is. Pretty much they wanted me to read through this kid's file and diagnose him with something, and ADHD was because he had attention problems. Yeah, and many incest survivors that are female are diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. 81% of patients diagnosed with DX stands for diagnosed severe history. HX is history of child use and neglect. So yeah, people with borderline personality disorder, it's not their fault. It's a horrible disease that affects everybody, especially other people. But yeah, they have a history of incest a lot of times and child abuse and neglect. A majority of them have it before the age of 7, which is, how can you molest a kid that's 7 years or younger? What do you get from that? It's just, ugh, can't imagine it. Many borderline personality disorder patients self-harm. That's pretty indicative of borderline personality disorder. Van Der Kolk was called at 3 a.m. 3 nights in a row to sew up a woman's neck because she cut it. Psychiatrist. He's a psychiatrist, and they have, they're medical doctors technically. Adults that were abused as kids often struggle with concentration, trouble with relationships, risky sex and sexual shutdown, large gaps in memory, self-destructive behaviors. So yeah, it's all indicative of BPD there. I think I'm going to take a break from these with all my personal life issues going on. So I'll definitely do neuroscience of personality disorder, Dario Nardi, October 2nd at 4. Then I'm going to hold off for a while on these book ones because they take 20, 30, 40 hours to, it's like having a part-time job that you don't get paid for, basically. So give this video a like. I worked my ass off on it. Van Der Kolk, along with other work group, and we got a message here. Thank you, Malmu, not leaving me hanging. Dear Kristen, MBTI YouTuber recommends this book. Do you think trauma can make people creative and empathetic? Yeah, there's something in the last chapter of this book, chapter 20. It talks about how theater is a treatment modality and how it's used. And Van Der Kolk talks about basically how traumatized people, how basically like plays and stuff and are very dramatic, and well, traumatic people are very dramatic, and they struggle with their own emotions, but they can relate to characters in the book. And they are, once they get past their insecurities and their trauma, they are very expressive and very good actors. So yeah, I definitely think it does help with creativity and stuff. I think art therapy is something that I'm going to enroll my son in. I know he likes art. I worked as a case manager for kids with behavioral health issues, and I've done dozens and dozens of referrals to art therapy, and I've heard nothing but great things about it. So if you struggle with traditional therapy, which we'll talk about more in this book too, it's not very beneficial for people with PTSD. It can be, but not all that beneficial. Other modalities are more beneficial. But yeah, that's interesting that she's an ESFP and she recommends this book. So good for her. I haven't watched many of her videos because I think she just does skits like, what's his face? Frank James, the mistyped INFP. I think skits just add to stereotypes and they don't really give anything beneficial, but I can definitely check her out. If you have any videos that you would like me to watch, let her know. I'm glad she recommended this book, and I highly recommend this book as well, obviously. Basically, they tried to make a diagnosis for the new edition of the DSM. It's disorder of extreme stress, not otherwise specified, DESNOS, aka, which later became coined as complex personality or PTSD. Like I said, reading this book was very validating for me. A lot of my thoughts are projected here. We think along the same lines, and it was great. And I definitely learned a lot of new things too. Like I said earlier, complex PTSD and personality disorders, I think, are just one and the same, and they are changed basically by personality type and a type of trauma you receive. So very interesting tangent there. And thank you, Mamu, for your question. I really appreciate that. And another quote here: how do we treat people who are coping with the fallout of abuse, betrayal, and abandonment when we are forced to diagnose them with depression, panic disorder, or bipolar illness, or borderline personality disorder, which do not really address what they are coping with? PTSD and trauma is the core to most physical or mental illness, I think, personality disorders. And we're just masking it. We're just giving these diagnoses because you basically, when you with these diagnoses, you're basically just so doctors can bill the insurance. That is the whole purpose of a diagnosis. So don't cling onto a diagnosis. I know I did when I got my diagnosis of avoidant personality disorder. It was very freeing for me. Overeating and trauma, which is something that greatly affected my life. Basically, you can't feel when you're full because trauma stunts bodily sensations. Again, it parallels a lot with SI demon. Or you can't feel that you're hungry or thirsty at all and you may not eat. That's another big thing with INJs. Traumatized women are often obese, and some use it as a way of protecting themselves because they were raped in the past. There's a big thing where I guess if you're fat or obese, which is something I struggled with my whole life, you're less attractive. So a lot of women will become obese on purpose to protect themselves from being raped, because if you're raped as a child, you have a higher prevalence of sexual abuse as you get older. Men working in prisons, which I can relate to, I worked in prisons, successfully lost weight and they gained it back to look bigger and stronger, to look more intimidating, to protect themselves as well. So size is often a way to protect yourself. And there's this bullshit belief that women have that bigger, stronger men can protect you, but that's not always the case. Got to give smaller men a chance too. Adverse childhood experiences, or ACE, which is a test that we did when I was working in an outpatient clinic. Therapists and clinicians did it. I really didn't do it. Basically, they interview people, talk about their childhood experiences, and if they had trauma, they kind of give them a rating. 2/3 of people reported had some kind of adverse childhood experiences. 1 in 10 had parents that swear or insulted them. 1/4 were physically abused. 28%, 16% of men reported sexual abuse. 1 out of 8 witnessed domestic violence or mom being assaulted. Half had learning or behavioral problems. The ACE score was 0 through 6, 5,000 times more likely to attempt suicide. So if you scored on the ACE test, you're much more likely to commit suicide. These statistics right here, I know they have to be flawed because men are conditioned to not talk about their problems. Women, like they say, they want an emotionally available man, but when we do talk about our emotions, our problems, we are accused of being feminine, told to shut up. I know when my grandmother died, who was my primary caregiver throughout life, my ESTP ex-wife with BPD pretty much called me a pussy and insulted me and told me that it was my fault that she died, which affected me greatly. I was just trying to grieve and look for comfort, but I couldn't find that comfort, unfortunately. So if a man is being emotional with you, encourage it and respect it, because we're people too, and society definitely discourages us from being emotional, which is not good. Chapter 10, Developmental Trauma, the Hidden Epidemic. The U.S. government definitely doesn't put behavioral health as a priority. Again, it's just take these meds and shut up. Mostly STJs in Congress, and not long-term. They're not long-term thinkers. They just want to solve a problem, get it over with, and ignore it. They're more concerned about killing people overseas, like I said earlier in this presentation, than helping its people. Traumatized people fill up jails, mental hospitals, public welfare systems, and medical clinics. Another big correlation that he talks about here is pretty much physical health and mental health are greatly linked. People with physical health issues have great medical health problems too. My mom was probably the most miserable person I ever met. She definitely had her mental health issues I shared, and she also had great physical health issues as well. She had heart problems her whole life, which, you can be born with heart problems, and that could be traumatic on its own. But she ended up abusing pills, opioids, and that ended up taking her life. So yeah, people who are traumatized often rely on substances as well, impulse control, do drugs, drink, smoke, overeat. Focus on mental health. Taxpayers would pay less overall. This is another thing that I thought of, and Dr. Van Der Kolk validated. Many economists believe this as well. Basically, if you're traumatized and you have mental health issues, you're going to be on public support for pretty much the rest of your life. There is a SMI status here in the United States called serious mental illness, basically who people are disabled because their mental illnesses prevent them from working and holding jobs. So they're just in and out of hospitals, in and out of jails, and they can't work, and they get public assistance for the rest of their lives. And a lot of times it's just a few $100 a month, so you're on the streets. A lot of homeless people are traumatized and suffer mental illness, and they can't control that. And unfortunately, they're just made to sleep out in the streets and terrorize everybody else. And not all homeless people are dangerous, and a lot of them are just helpless, or they're having bad luck. So be empathetic with them. If we were to treat this stuff and actually help people rather than murder people, we would have less people in prison. But the whole private prison system is a whole other tangent, which I worked in. Won't go there. They make criminals on purpose for profit, which is disgusting. Pharmaceutical companies love pumping people with meds. Alcohol distributors, they make a ton of people money off traumatized people. Maria was traumatized. She became mute and violent when she approaches, and when she's approached, that should be approached, not approaches, sorry. Equine therapy is basically where you work with horses and you can't feel your own bodily sensations, like I spoke about and Dr. Van Der Kolk speaks about. So you're grooming horses, you're taking care of horses, you're walking them, you don't necessarily ride them. So this is good if you can't feel bodily sensation. And basically you feel the animal moving. Like if you're brushing it and it startles, you can feel that animal become startled when it's scared, and you can kind of learn that yourself. So you learn basically from the horse, which is kind of cool, I think. And a few months ago, I talked to an ESTP who was diagnosed with autism, oddly enough, and she said that she was venting to me. She was actually trying to manipulate me to get an extra cigarette on her smoke break. But anyways, story, true or not, she was molested as a kid and she became mute and shut down. And mom took her to a psychiatrist. Oh, you're autistic because you have speech problems. So she was diagnosed with autism. It was really borderline personality disorder. Again, traumatized people with their medial prefrontal cortex. I think that was it. I was probably wrong on that. So anyways, it basically stunts the sensing parts of your brain. So you can't, it goes back from left brain to right brain. The left brain articulates the problem. The right brain pretty much projects it over and over like you're reliving it. This person shut down because of her trauma. They labeled her autism. Again, she wasn't autistic. She was very fine and had no problems with social interaction, as ESTPs don't usually. But she was able to graduate high school, and they also blame genetic components too, like you're schizophrenic. Like you have a higher chance of schizophrenia if you have an immediate family member who has schizophrenia, which may be true. Or maybe you're traumatized by a schizophrenic person and you're going to become schizophrenic because you're traumatized that way. Who knows? We often hear that mental illness can be genetic. We cannot say anything about schizophrenia. It does seem to have a genetic factor. Many genes work together to influence a single outcome. Modern psychology has simplified it and tied to genes and the study of rats. Basically, the pups, which they call baby rats, I learned that are licked more in the first 12 hours of birth, were braver and more resilient to all the sadistic studies that people do on them, I guess. But I guess we got to learn some way. And the rats that weren't licked and nurtured in the first 12 hours of life were more fearful and less resilient. Nature versus nurture. Type is nature. Trauma is nurture. So we're going to vary basically on our type. We may be the same types, but we have different experiences throughout life. So it's going to change and differ basically how you're traumatized or not traumatized throughout life. Rhesus monkeys, they share 95% of genetic makeup with humans. They talk about attachment styles with humans. And I'm probably not pronouncing their name right. Study found that they're anxious and avoidant monkeys. Both type of monkeys would overindulge in alcohol that were avoidant and anxious. The aggressive avoidant monkeys would drink and pass out. Anxious monkeys would pass out, or that shouldn't be pass out. Anxious monkeys would do it to pretty much alleviate their trauma. Basically, they would use it as a coping skill. Avoidant monkeys would pass out drunk. I don't know exactly the reasons why there. The ones that had aggressive mothers were physically abusive. If baby monkeys lived, the mothers would often kill them a lot of times, or they would keep them from making friends, which, well, mom didn't kill me, obviously, but she kept me from making friends. And that's just kind of how it would become avoidant or anxious as far as rhesus monkeys go. Again, I can't cover this entire book. I couldn't retain this entire book. INTJs aren't super geniuses like people speculate. So forgive me if I don't remember all the details. Childhood trauma differs from adult trauma. Van Der Kolk's organization examined 200 files of kids. A vast majority of kids come from extremely dysfunctional homes. Half of them were emotionally abused or impaired by an impaired caretaker. My mother and stepfather were impaired because they had trauma themselves. Half of them had a parent in jail, mental facility, or pretty much deployed to the military. A lot of people will go to the military just to avoid raising their kids, which I know I had an ISTP friend who was married to an ISFP, and basically that's what she did. I think she had borderline personality disorder too. And she went to Germany to the military and basically left her family. Half of them witnessed domestic violence, and a quarter are physically or sexually assaulted. Another quote here, the DSM definition of PTSD is quite straightforward. A person is exposed to a horrendous event that involve actual or threatened death or serious injury, or a threat to the physical integrity of self and others, causing intense fear, helplessness, or horror, which results in a variety of manifestations. Intrusive re-experiencing of the event, flashbacks, bad dreams, feeling as if the event were reoccurring, persistent and crippling avoidance of people, places, thoughts, or feelings associated with trauma, sometimes with amnesia or important parts of it, and increased arousal, insomnia, hypervigilance, or irritability. 82% of children seen by the National Traumatic Stress Network do not meet the criteria for PTSD. That probably should be do meet. I don't know. I probably got that wrong. Get pseudo-scientific diagnosis, not my quote, oppositional defiant disorder, disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, or don't receive proper treatment. So ODD, oppositional defiant disorder, is something that kids are pretty much diagnosed with a lot too. It's kind of seen as a precursor to antisocial personality disorder. And antisocial in clinical psychology doesn't mean you avoid people or social situations. It means you're against society. You're a criminal. You're a petty thug. ODD is pretty much kids that are just defiant. They won't listen. They do what they want. They are aggressive. They lack empathy. So, and disruptive mood dysregulation disorder is probably, basically traumatized kids who can't regulate their own mood. They don't receive proper treatment. They're given pills, stimulants, whatever, and call it a day. Work group proposed of another diagnosis in the DSM-5, trauma, developmental trauma, pervasive pattern of dysregulation, problems with attention and concentration, difficulties getting along with self and others. Instead of giving all like PTSD, ADHD, autism, ODD, all these different diagnoses that are pretty much just showing one side of the trauma. Basically, you give one diagnosis and worry about the symptoms rather than the diagnosis itself. American Psychiatric, read this. This is very important. This is the big divide between intuition and sensing. And sensing is in control of it, unfortunately. American Psychiatric Association sent a letter denying the diagnosis. The notion that early childhood adverse experiences lead to substantial developmental disruptions is more clinical intuition than research-based fact. This statement is commonly made but cannot be backed up by prospective studies. STJs think that everything can be replicated in a lab. Everything cannot be replicated in a lab. Okay? We cannot read people's minds. This is it. I hear a lot of INTJs that are just too TE focused and pretty much conditioned to ignore or NI or NE. And basically, if something isn't studied, it isn't real, but we can't study everything. We haven't studied everything. There's more that we don't know than we do know. So quit having these stupid fucking ideas, people, really. Back to the DSM, real liability. Basically, if you can't replicate it, it isn't real. Like if you do a study and you find something and other people can't replicate it, then it isn't consistent, then they don't deem it as real. That's the biggest criticism of typology and MBTI and all that stuff. Like people can't replicate it. There's too many different systems. We are all over the place. People keep saying, well, we need this system, we need that system. Someone who studies typology for a year and a half thinks they can come up with their own typology system. And it's just convoluting things. It's making things worse. It's harder to replicate. We have to, I think, beat them at their own game. We need to figure out to be on the same page and replicate type. I think type is going to be the biggest treatment to trauma. If we type people, I think people will respond differently to different treatments based on their trauma and their type, their personality type. So we need to get on the same page here. That's why I'm not really concerned about making my own typology system. There's enough of them. We don't need any more. These are the same criticisms that modern psychology accused typology of. The APA, the American Psychiatric Association, earned $100 million in sales from the DSM-4. And they just keep reissuing this almost every 10 years. So it's just money driven, basically. And the DSM-3 admit that it should have never been used for insurance purposes, and that's primarily what it's used for today. I'm almost done here, so I appreciate it. We are on 80 of 94. Nearly every developed nation in the world provides aid to parents. The U.S. doesn't provide any guaranteed support to families. Economists predict that familial assistance would pay for itself in the long run. Every dollar invested in home visitation, daycare, preschool would save $7 in welfare for every $1 spent on these resources. Censors just won't listen. I know in Canada, I was talking to somebody and they get $500 a month allowance for childcare. Childcare is ridiculously expensive in the United States, and you have to pretty much leave kids at the mercy of strangers, basically. You don't, like, they get this fingerprint clearance card, and in Arizona, I don't know about the rest of the US, you get it once every 6 years. They check your background once every 6 years. And keep in mind, a criminal background is what you got caught doing. It's not what you actually have done. Part 4, the imprint of trauma. Chapter 11, uncovering the secrets of problems of traumatic memory. Catholic pedophiles. I don't see how anybody is Catholic. SI users need slapped. Julian repressed the memories of sexual abuse by a Catholic priest. Saw on the news that a Catholic priest, I forgot his name, was arrested for sexual abuse, and memories all suddenly started resurfacing. All the victims had similar memories, including the names, dates, and furnitures in a room. So basically, like I was recalling, a lot of people who were sexually abused and traumatized, they repress these memories. And Julian was one. And another big thing, that he became like this steroid using bodybuilder, and that was a way to kind of protect himself. Like I said, men put on weight in prison to kind of protect themselves because they're more bigger and intimidating. Julian did the same coping mechanism, and he brought back a flood of memories after seeing this. Again, I worked very hard on this video. Please give it a thumbs up so it reaches more people. I think this book is probably one of the most important books ever written, in my opinion. Media and courts dismiss people losing memories of events and coming back later. I knew an ENFP who actually really, really liked me, but I wouldn't believe it because my self-confidence and my FE trickster kept me from doing that. And also, we have Mike returning, the INTJ with schizoid that I interviewed not too long ago, and his girlfriend, who's an ENFP with dissociative identity disorder, basically, which is multiple personality disorder, that was renamed because of the stigma. They're coming on Thursday, 4 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. So be able to check, make sure you check that out. There'll be a live stream with questions. It was a very interesting interview that I did. One of my favorite podcasts. Anyways, she caused a rollover accident in a van. She was basically swerving back and forth, and vans are top heavy, so they tip over. A 90-pound girl that was in the front seat with her, who was in her seatbelt, rolled over, and basically it snapped her spine. Seatbelts don't always save lives. Sometimes they take them. And my ESTP friends, I had 2 in there, they pretty much fell out of the van. One broke his arm, shattered it, has a metal plate in there. And the other one, I think he broke his leg, but he came out pretty unscathed compared to everybody else. The ENFP was fine, but she was in denial of it. And a lot of people thought that, she was just being a bitch, basically. But and INFPs are kind of known being manipulative. Maybe she was, maybe she wasn't, but maybe she was just repressing this because it was very horrible. I mean, I'd feel guilty if I caused somebody to die in an accident, and she was just goofing off, basically. Basically these kids, they lost memory of it, and they started resurging after they found it, and people were pretty much criticizing them and telling them that they were lying, which maybe this Me Too movement has something to it. I think a lot of times women are just manipulative and accuse men of sexual abuse, but everything should be taken into consideration. But in today's society, we just accuse men without any trial or without any proof or evidence, and their lives are basically ruined. So I think, not saying that all women are irrational, but the masculine and feminine paradigm, basically, masculine is rational and emotional is feminine. And again, there's rational women out there and emotional men. Masculine, feminine, not necessarily male and female. It's just traits of 2 different sides of the yin and yang. Basically, these emotional outbursts are pretty much interfering with rational processes that protect people. So we do need to protect this. I do think that women are sexually abused. It's horrible and it shouldn't happen, but we just can't have somebody say that they were sexually abused and just take it as truth. We need to look into it. And there's a thing called due process. It's very important. As controversial that may be, like it or not, I don't care. Pierre Janet, a French researcher in the 1800s, pretty much studied PTSD before it was coined. He coined the term vehement emotions. Basically, traumatized people would repeat certain actions, emotions, and sensations. Explanation for demonic possession and exorcism. Irene was trying to nurse her mother back to health who died from tuberculosis, and basically she kept her alive, pretending like she was alive. I was on the dark web one time just browsing around, and I saw this site where, I don't know how I stumbled upon this, but mothers basically with their babies that died, they would post pictures of themselves. It was like an online community with their babies, and they were pretending that they're still alive. They couldn't process the baby's death, and they would buy them new clothes and dress them up. It was It was creepy. Yeah, it was a very weird online community, but I couldn't imagine losing my son. It would be very horrible, and I can empathize with what they're going through, and they probably just couldn't process their baby's death. Another quote, but in Julian's case, the sensations, the thoughts, and the emotions of the trauma were stored separately as frozen, barely comprehensible fragments. If the problem of PTSD is dissociation, the goal of the treatment would be association, and integrating the cutoff of element of the trauma into ongoing narrative life, so that the brain can recognize that this was then and this is now. So basically, like, you just keep reliving this trauma, and when you're traumatized, reliving memories, it feels like it's happening now. I know a Vietnam vet in this book. He would annually stage an armed robbery. He would basically put his finger in a coat like you would see on TV and pretend like he had a gun. What he was really trying to do was suicide by cop. They would think he had a gun and to shoot him. He felt guilty of his friend's death in Vietnam. And every year on the anniversary of his death, he would try to stage suicide by cop, but I guess it never worked. Professionals such as police, social workers need to be trauma informed. I had this ESFJ therapist who was very, very cruel to me in a lot of ways. It kind of pulled my head out of my ass in the same way, but she would not recognize my trauma and the effects of my trauma, and it was kind of not validating and not helpful in a lot of ways, but it was. All right, I think this is the last chapter. Thank you for bearing with me. If you watch this whole thing, I appreciate it. Chapter 12, The Unbearable Heaviness of Remembering. The British in World War I came up with this term shell shock. All soldiers with psychiatric issues were given this diagnosis. Not yet diagnosed nervous. German soldiers saw it as a character defect with soldiers, and they were punished for basically having PTSD, which sucks. And it's just going to make it worse. U.S. soldiers were promised a pension for fighting in 1932 during the Great Depression. 15,000 unemployed vets, they camped in a mall in Washington, D.C. as a protest. President Hoover called in the National Guard, and they were cleared out, and they never received this pension that they were promised. Vets are treated horribly in this country. I saw a sign a few months ago of a vet, or he claimed to be a vet. He had no legs, and he was homeless, and he was begging for money. Why is this a thing? He had no legs. He can't really work. Why is he on the streets? He served his country, which I think if you go in the military, you kind of do it yourself. You shouldn't support this country unless like something like World War II, which was necessary. A brutal dictator, Hitler, of course, who was supposed to be an INFJ, oddly enough, was doing some horrible things and needed to be stopped. But right now it's just oil and power. Our wars are, so it sucks. There's this documentary I want to check out. I keep forgetting about Let There Be Light. Basically, the primary treatment for these vets was hypnotherapy. And it's not widely used anymore because the insurance, I guess I talked to an INTJ hypnotherapist, and he disagrees with me and says there is empirical evidence on this. So Van Der Kolk could be wrong about this, and insurance does cover hypnotherapy. But it's pretty much dismissed as a lack of empirical evidence. And Van Der Kolk has an NI prediction that it will become more prevalent in the future. Hopefully it does. It's something I always wanted to check out, but I can never pay for it because it's really expensive. In order to understand trauma, we have to overcome our natural reluctance to confront that reality and cultivate courage to listen to the testimonies of survivors. Auschwitz survivor Charlotte Delbo disassociated and said that she wasn't in a concentration camp. Another person was rather than her. So basically, she was in a concentration camp, and in order to cope with it, she disassociated. She left her body basically and saw another person there and not her. Nancy had a horrible experience and went through surgery without proper anesthesia. She was unconscious, but she could feel everything. After that experience, she couldn't use hair dryers, toasters, curling irons because they burned her to sear the wound, basically. She felt disconnected. She couldn't sleep. She struggles with this day. Stopped eating and lost a lot of weight. All right, I couldn't get into everything, but this is part 1 of part 2. Join us September 18th, 7 p.m. Eastern time for chapters 13 through 20 and part 5 of this book. I appreciate it. Maomu, I appreciate the question. I'm sure there were some people watching who were reluctant to ask questions because they probably brought up memories of their own trauma. I encourage you to talk about it, and I'm sorry you experienced these things. Think if we're going to be on a clickbait, I'll go ahead and link Gifts Differing we reviewed last month by Isabel Myers. So go ahead and check that out.